Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is Garrett Herrin, CEO and publisher at VoteHub. Garrett, thank you so much for joining me.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
It is a busy day to say the least. It is Election Day Eve right now, and over 76 million people have voted early, either by mail or in person. So I would love for you to break down the numbers that we're seeing come in so far. What sticks out to you?
Well, I would say let's focus on the battleground states because that's what's going to determine the election. We're seeing a different picture according to which battleground state it is, and that's really just based on the percentage that goes to the early vote compared to the election day vote. So, take for example a state like Nevada. It's a state that leans heavily into early voting, and in that state, Republicans have actually outpaced Democrats in early voting. But there's a pretty high amount of independents who have also voted there. And so this is going to be a theme in the battleground states. In a state like Florida, arguably maybe not a battleground state this cycle, Republicans have also outpaced Democrats, but a lot of independents have voted there. And the same story with North Carolina. This is not what we saw in 2020 at all. But in the Rust Belt, we see a different picture. So take a state like Pennsylvania. Democrats had a 56% request rate, and they returned 56% of their ballots. Republicans had a 33% request rate. They've returned 33% of their ballots. Pennsylvania, about 25% of the vote, of the total vote, is going to be early, though. So it's not, Pennsylvania doesn't have traditional in-person early voting. They have mail voting. And so, the majority of votes are going to be cast on Election Day, which is the reason why I caution people against reading the early voting tea leaves too much, because the partisan makeup of the early vote in states where we just don't have too many results. Yes, it's skewing Democratic, but the election day vote, we don't know what that breakdown is going to look like.
I was just going to say that because people love reading the tea leaves before. Obviously, we like getting our hands on any piece of data we can. But historically, we do know that early voting trends Democrat. So when you're talking about those certain states where you're seeing Republicans really come out and outpace Democrats, how nervous does the Harris campaign need to be? Or like you're saying, are you saying take that with a grain of salt?
I think both Democrats and Republicans should take that with a grain of salt. I think one reason why this is happening is Donald Trump is encouraging his voters to vote early, to vote by mail. This is something in 2020 he did not do. He encouraged all of his voters to wait until election day to vote. And I think in hindsight, that was a mistake from the Trump campaign. And so, this time, Democrats, it looks like they're going to kind of revert back to their pre-pandemic patterns, voting patterns of voting more on election day. In a state like Nevada, for instance, in Clark County, the biggest county, the breakdown between Democrats and Republicans is expected to be around even on election day. And in 2020, Republicans far outpaced Democrats in the election day vote. But a key constituency here are going to be the independent voters. So we've seen in the last 4 years, Republican registration has outpaced Democratic registration in pretty much every battleground state. But independent registration has also been way up, and that's been driven by young people especially. And so even though, a lot of early voting analysis looks at, the Democratic early vote versus Republican early vote, those independents, if these are young people who are registering independent, may well skew Democratic. And so it's kind of skewing the numbers right now in a way that it didn't in the previous two presidential elections.
Aside from party, is there any pattern you're seeing in terms of early voting when it comes to certain demographics?
Yes, actually. So women are showing up in pretty big numbers. in the battlegrounds, in some cases, women are making up anywhere from have a 5 to 10 point margin on men. And so, I think early on in the early voting cycle, we saw that pattern, and really we could have chalked that up to just voter enthusiasm. But if you're a Democrat right now, you have to wonder whether that may be the Dobbs effect in action, and if we're going to see the same sort of disproportionate turnout with women on election day as well, which one would think, because women disproportionately support Democrats, would benefit Kamala Harris.
When you look at the battleground states specifically, because obviously every state is important, but to this election in particular, all eyes are going to be on those 7 battleground states tomorrow night. Is there any trend that's surprising you in any of those states?
Well, there seems to be a late-breaking pattern across the battleground states, just based on the last week of public polling that we've had. So the majority of public polls, though, are still herding, and what herding means is kind of coming to the same conclusion, which is basically a tied race. And historically, the past couple of presidential elections, we haven't seen that much consistency. And so it would be pretty rare if that was actually the case, that all the pollsters are finding the same result. So a couple of days ago, a highly respected pollster named J.N. Seltzer released her much anticipated poll in Iowa. Now, Iowa is not really considered a battleground anymore. Neither the Harris campaign nor the Trump campaign have visited Iowa or invested much resources in Iowa. But Iowa kind of mirrors the demographics of nearby Midwestern states like Wisconsin, to a lesser extent Michigan. And in Iowa, there was a shock poll that actually had Harris ahead by 3 points. And so that is a significant outlier. That would be a massive overperformance for the Democrats compared to 2020. And so that poll has given Democrats a lot of late-breaking enthusiasm, because in the Rust Belt polls, the Rust Belt is must win. That blue wall is so key for an electoral college victory for Kamala Harris. And if it is true that Iowa is anywhere close to Harris being up by 3, even if that poll's off by 5 or so, then that could spell positive signs for Harris in a state like Wisconsin.
That poll was really interesting, made a lot of news over the weekend, because what we've been hearing now for months, ever since the race became Trump versus Harris, it's a tight race, tight race, tight race. Based on the numbers, based on what you're seeing now, and I know you said people don't read into the tea leaves too much, but we are one day away from Election Day. Based on what you're seeing, do you think it's going to be as tight of a race as the pollsters are predicting?
Probably not, actually. There's this thing called polling error, and in 2020, that polling error was quite high. It was, around 4 points or so. And in 2016, it was a little lower, but polling error can go in either direction. With the state polling averages being as close as they are, if we just have an average polling error of around 3 points, in either direction, let's say it's, uniform or something, that would result in an electoral college blowout for either Harris or Trump. So even though the polls are currently suggesting a tied race, even if they're historically accurate, one candidate still may sweep, all of the swing states, and that would not be surprising historically.
This race is coming down to a game of math here. It's coming down to the numbers, the race to 270. So whose pathway to victory do you think is easier? You mentioned that blue wall that Harris must win. As of now, as how the numbers are shaking out now, who has the easy pathway here?
Kamala Harris has the simplest pathway. Because winning Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania gives you exactly 270 electoral votes if you also win the 2nd congressional district of Nebraska. But at the same time, if she loses any one of those states, then she's going to need to make up ground in the Sun Belt. And currently, there's not any Sun Belt state that VoteHub has in its polling averages where Harris is ahead. And so, we would have to rely on a polling error in Harris's direction in at least one of the Sun Belt states in order for her to make up for, any stumbles that happen in the Rust Belt.
Tomorrow night, obviously, as polls are closing, starting on the East Coast on down, what specifically are you looking out for? Because I know VoteHub is going to be tabulating every single state, every single vote, but where is your eye going to be on specifically? What should we be looking at a little more?
Yeah, so I would encourage people to look at the shifts that we, from the 2020 election in Democratic vote-rich areas like Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, in Detroit and in Milwaukee. And so, at VoteHub, we are going to be waiting until a precinct has substantially completed its counting. When we do that, we will have a shift from 2020, and so we'll be able to see, whether these Democratic vote-rich areas are, shifting more toward Donald Trump or not. And so, if that happens in Pennsylvania, where polls close a little earlier than the other battleground states, then we may expect to see the same pattern in other states. Now, at the same time, the trends are on the Democrat side in the suburbs, and so we want to look out for those shifts in the suburbs as well and in the rural areas. And then finally, we want to look at turnout. So, take a state like Pennsylvania, and particularly in Philadelphia. In Philadelphia, only about 25% of the expected vote, total vote, has been cast so far in the mail votes. And so 75% of the vote we're expecting to come on Election Day. We have a pretty solid number that we think Democrats need to hit, which is around 500,000 or so voters. And so when polls close, we'll know how many people have voted. And so if it's less than 500,000, then Democrats would need to make up that ground in the turnout elsewhere in the state.
As someone who is the numbers person here, your head's down, looking at all the data, do you think then anything is missing from the national conversation when it comes to this election?
I think particularly what's missing in the national conversation is the accuracy of polling. Because because people are taking it at face value, and we know that it was pretty off in 2020, it was pretty off in 2016. It may be again this time, and that's not to say that it's going to favor Republicans or not this time. But there is the problem last time was there was a non-response bias that favored Democrats. Republicans just weren't answering pollsters' phone calls, or they weren't answering honestly. And we may see the same thing this time within certain demographic groups. I think that an understudied component of this election may be turnout among women in particular. And so, that's going to become clearer come tomorrow night, whether that had a large impact.
Well, there is certainly a lot to keep our eye on, and I appreciate you coming on, breaking down the numbers with me. You are welcome back anytime. Garrett Herrin, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.